At the dinner table, Diana Whitfield looked at the man in the rented suit and decided, without asking his name, that he did not belong. In front of the entire board, she said it out loud, certain that no one in that room could possibly object. She did not know that 12 years earlier that same man had stood in a locked training room and taught every operative, every guard, every security chief now standing watch outside that door, the exact methods now keeping her alive tonight. Jackson Bryant, without a word, only folded his napkin quietly and simply waited. Who was the quiet man at that table, really? Stay until the very end to learn the full, astonishing truth. The dining hall at Calloway House did not look like a place where secrets could survive. Crystal chandeliers threw soft gold light across linen tablecloths, and the scent of rosemary and butter drifted from the kitchen long before the first guest arrived. It was the kind of private club where senators dined beside hedge fund managers, where reservations were measured in years rather than weeks, and where the staff moved like shadows, present only when needed and invisible otherwise. Jackson Bryant had worked there for nearly 4 years, first as a night porter, then as the quiet, watchful figure who stood near the entrance and decided with a glance who deserved a smile and who deserved a closer look. Nobody asked him much about his past, and he preferred it that way. He kept his uniform pressed, his shoes polished, and his opinions to himself, and in exchange the building gave him something he had not expected to need so badly. A place where nothing important depended on his judgment, where the worst thing that could happen on a given night was a delayed appetizer or an overbooked table. That evening, before his shift began, he sat in the small employee break room with his phone propped against a stack of folded napkins, watching his daughter's face fill the screen. Hannah was 8 years old, missing a tooth on the upper left side and entirely unbothered by the gap. She held up a drawing of a dog with too many legs and explained with great seriousness that it was actually a very fast dog built that way on purpose. Jackson laughed, the kind of laugh that came easily only around her, and told her the dog looked like it could outrun anything in the whole city, maybe the whole country. She asked when he was coming home, and he told her soon, the way he always did, and meant it the way he always did. Her grandmother's voice called from somewhere off-screen, reminding her that bath time waited for no one, and Hannah rolled her eyes in the dramatic way only 8-year-olds can manage, before blowing him a quick kiss and disappearing from view. The small room felt quieter once she was gone, the way rooms always did, but Jackson sat with the quiet for a moment longer than usual, letting it settle before he stood and smoothed down his jacket. One of the longtime servers, a soft-spoken woman named Kara who had worked the floor at Calloway House longer than almost anyone else, often told the newer staff that Jackson was the only person in the building who never seemed rattled, no matter how chaotic a private function became behind the scenes. She did not know why, and she never asked, because something in the calm, deliberate way he carried himself suggested the question would not be welcome. She simply trusted him the way the rest of the staff eventually learned to trust him, quietly and without needing an explanation for it. He checked his tie in the mirror by the coat room, adjusted a wrinkle that was not really there, and walked into the hallway where the first sounds of the evening were beginning to gather, glasses clinking somewhere in preparation, low voices rehearsing the night's choreography. He moved without hurry, the way men moved when they had once been trained to read a room before stepping into it, eyes flicking briefly toward exits and sightlines out of pure habit rather than necessity. The maitre d', a nervous young man named Oliver who had only worked there a few months, mentioned that tonight's private function belonged to Whitfield Global, a name that meant nothing to most of the staff and everything to anyone who followed finance news closely. Jackson only nodded. He had heard the name before, years ago, in another life, attached to memos and security briefings rather than dinner reservations, but he did not let the memory show on his face, because that was a skill no one in this building knew he still carried. Diana Whitfield arrived precisely on time, the way she arrived everywhere, trailed by an entourage that seemed to part the air around her before she even stepped through it. She was the chief executive of Whitfield Global, a sprawling company that touched finance, logistics, and private security contracts across 3 continents, and she had built much of her reputation on never appearing rattled, not in boardrooms, not in front of cameras, not in the quiet hours after a deal collapsed. Tonight mattered more than most nights. A group of investors visiting from overseas were weighing a partnership that would double the company's reach into markets it had spent years trying to enter, and Diana intended to give them a flawless evening, the kind that left no room for doubt about who was in control of the room and everything in it. Diana had not always been this exacting about appearances, but a security breach early in her tenure as chief executive, one that leaked sensitive merger details to a rival firm through nothing more than a careless badge left unattended in a hotel lobby, had cost the company dearly and cost her personally even more. She had learned in the aftermath of that humiliation to trust very few people completely and to judge competence quickly and harshly, because she had once paid an enormous price for trusting someone who turned out to be careless rather than capable. The lesson had hardened into instinct over the years, an instinct that now, without her fully realizing it, shaped the way she looked at almost everyone standing below her on an organizational chart. Beside her walked Carter Voss, the company's global head of security, a broad-shouldered man with a practiced smile and a habit of mentioning his own accomplishments before anyone thought to ask about them. Carter had spent the better part of a decade telling new hires and nervous investors the same story over good wine and better lighting, that he personally designed the executive protection program that kept Whitfield Global's leadership safe in every city they operated in. It was a good story, polished smooth by years of repetition. It was also, in every meaningful sense, untrue, though almost no one left inside that company still remembered who had actually built it, and Carter had long since stopped worrying that anyone ever would. The private dining room had been arranged with care, long tables dressed in ivory linen, candlelight flickering against polished silver, a string quartet playing softly near the far wall, the kind of careful staging meant to suggest effortlessness while costing a great deal of effort behind the scenes. Diana moved through the room the way a queen might move through a court she had built herself, shaking hands, offering compliments that sounded sincere because she had practiced them for years, steering every conversation gently back toward the partnership she needed to close before the night ended. Margaret Calloway, her chief of staff for nearly 6 years, trailed a half step behind, watching the room with the quiet vigilance of someone whose entire job was noticing what Diana did not have time to notice herself. It was Jackson who first caught Diana's eye, though not for any reason that flattered him. He stood near the side entrance in his dark uniform, hands folded, watching the room the way he had once watched far more dangerous rooms, scanning exits out of old habit, noting who lingered too long near the windows, registering small details that meant nothing here but had once meant everything. To Diana, exhausted from months of preparation and irritated by a small delay in the appetizer service, he simply looked like an employee standing idle while she needed something fixed immediately. She crossed the room toward him without softening her tone, the way she rarely softened it for anyone below a certain title on a night this important. She asked him, in front of 2 investors and 3 board members, why the kitchen was running behind schedule and whether anyone competent was actually managing tonight's service at all. Jackson answered calmly that the timing was intentional, paced deliberately to match the evening's wine pairing, and that everything remained under control. It was the wrong answer for the mood she was in, or perhaps the right answer delivered with more composure than she expected from someone she had already decided to dismiss. She turned slightly toward her board members, the corner of her mouth lifting into something between amusement and contempt, and said that it was remarkable what passed for competence these days, that perhaps someone had hired the wrong man for the wrong job entirely. A ripple of polite, uncomfortable laughter moved through the nearest guests, the kind of laughter people offer when they are unsure whether laughing is required of them. Jackson did not argue. He had spent enough years in rooms far more dangerous than this one to know that dignity was rarely won by raising your voice in front of an audience that had already chosen its side. He simply folded his hands a little tighter, met her eyes for one long, steady second that lasted just slightly too long to be comfortable, and said nothing at all. Margaret noticed the silence more than anyone else in the room did. She noticed the way he held himself, not like a man embarrassed by the moment, but like a man who had decided long ago that some battles were never worth fighting in front of strangers holding wine glasses. She filed the impression away quietly, without quite knowing yet why it mattered, and turned back to the conversation Diana had already moved on to. What none of them knew, what none of them could possibly have known, was that 12 years earlier, in a different city and a very different version of his life, Jackson Bryant had answered to a single name inside a small, secure facility outside Washington. The operatives who trained there called him Ghost, partly because he rarely spoke more than necessary, and partly because he had a habit of disappearing from a room the moment his work in it was finished, leaving behind only the lesson and never the lecture. He had built protection doctrines for corporate executives operating in unstable regions, careful systems of routine and redundancy that eventually became the backbone of programs used by companies across the country, including, in its earliest and most fragile years, the very company whose chief executive had just humiliated him over a delayed appetizer course. He had trained the first generation of Whitfield Global's security personnel himself, standing in a windowless room with a whiteboard and a stopwatch, drilling young agents on threat assessment, evacuation routes, and the particular discipline of staying calm when every instinct in the body demanded panic instead. Many of those agents had long since moved on, promoted into other companies or retired into quiet consulting work scattered across the country, but a few of his methods remained baked permanently into the company's procedures, repeated by trainers who had never met him and credited falsely to men who had simply inherited his work without ever questioning where it came from. He had walked away from that life after an assignment overseas went wrong in a way he never fully spoke about, not even to the people closest to him. A protective detail under his command had made a single misjudged call during a routine relocation, a call that should never have fallen to such junior hands, and the consequences had followed him home long after the official reports were filed and quietly closed. He carried no formal blame for what happened, but he carried something heavier than blame, a private conviction that the weight of other people's safety had finally grown too large for one man to hold without eventually dropping something precious. He had chosen, deliberately and without regret, to disappear into ordinary work where no one else's safety would ever again depend entirely on his judgment. Carter Voss had been one of the very last agents Jackson personally trained before leaving that world behind for good. Carter had been ambitious even then, quick to claim credit for group exercises, slower to admit when his own assessments turned out wrong during live drills. After Jackson vanished from the program without explanation, Carter quietly rewrote his own history one conversation at a time, layering himself into stories that were never originally his, until enough years had passed that almost no one left in the company could contradict him without sounding paranoid. Carter had joined the security division as a junior agent with more confidence than skill, the kind of young man who measured his own progress by how quickly others noticed him rather than by how well he actually performed under pressure. After Jackson's sudden departure left a vacancy at the top of the training program, Carter maneuvered himself into the gap with practiced charm, volunteering for committees, befriending the right executives, and slowly positioning himself as the natural heir to a legacy that had never truly belonged to him. The promotion came easily once enough people assumed, simply because he never corrected them, that he deserved it. It was a comfortable lie, and comfortable lies, left unchallenged long enough, begin to feel like simple truth even to the very people who first built them out of convenience. The investors did not stay long enough to register the tension simmering quietly beneath the dinner's polished surface. They left with warm handshakes and vague promises, the kind that meant nothing concrete had been decided but nothing essential had been lost either. Diana exhaled only once she was certain the last car had pulled away from the curb, and for a moment, standing alone near the entrance in the cooling night air, she allowed herself the small, private satisfaction of believing the evening had gone reasonably well despite the earlier friction. She did not think again about the quiet man near the side door, not that night, not for several weeks afterward. He finished the rest of his shift without complaint, refilling water glasses and directing guests toward the coat room with the same even courtesy he showed every night. And if anyone noticed a slight stiffness in his posture for the remainder of the evening, they assumed it was simple fatigue rather than anything deeper. On the drive home, well past midnight, he found himself thinking less about the insult itself and more about how easily it had come to her, how naturally contempt seemed to sit in some people's mouths when they believed no consequence would ever follow it. He decided, somewhere around the third quiet intersection, that the moment did not deserve any more of his thoughts than it had already taken. And by the time he reached his apartment, he had mostly let it go, the way he had trained himself to let go of far heavier things over the years. The cracks revealed themselves slowly, the way structural damage often does, hidden behind fresh paint until the weight finally becomes too much to hide. A routine audit, ordered as part of the ongoing partnership discussions, uncovered gaps in Whitfield Global's executive protection protocols that should never have existed in a company of its size and reputation. Travel routes for senior leadership had not been meaningfully updated in years. Emergency response drills had quietly shrunk into formalities, run on paper in conference rooms rather than practiced under any real pressure. When the board convened to review the findings, When the board convened to review the findings, one of the longest-serving directors asked Carter plainly why a company of their size and exposure had allowed its emergency drills to become a paperwork exercise rather than a practiced reality. Carter answered smoothly that the threat landscape had simply changed, that modern protection relied more on software and monitoring than on the old physical drills of years past. An answer that sounded reasonable until someone pointed out that the software in question had not been updated in roughly the same span of time as the drills themselves. Carter Voss offered confident reassurances that did not match the evidence laid out in front of them on the long mahogany table, and for the first time in a long while, Diana felt something she rarely allowed herself to feel in front of her own staff: genuine doubt about a man she had trusted without question for years. Margaret Calloway began quietly pulling old personnel files afterward, partly out of professional caution and partly because something about that earlier dinner had stayed with her longer than it reasonably should have. She found a folder, decades old and faintly yellowed at the edges, referencing a foundational security training program from the company's earliest years, the very program that had clearly shaped everything built on top of it since. The architect's name had been redacted in most surviving copies, replaced with initials that meant nothing to her at first glance, but one surviving memo, buried deep in an archive nobody had opened in years, listed a single full name beside those initials in faded blue ink. She read it twice before she set the page down carefully, because the name on that page did not belong to Carter Voss at all and had never belonged to him. Samuel Reyes arrived at the company's headquarters the following week as an outside consultant, brought in specifically to help assess the gaps the audit had so plainly exposed. Samuel had spent years working executive protection details after leaving government service behind, and he carried a reputation for being thorough, blunt, and almost entirely uninterested in office politics or the careful egos that came with them. He was walking through the lobby when he saw a familiar figure near the security desk, helping a junior guard recalibrate a malfunctioning badge scanner with the kind of patient, exact movements that few people simply pick up on their own without years of practice behind them. Samuel stopped mid-stride, studied the man's face for a long moment under the bright lobby light, and said a name out loud that startled the people standing nearest to him. Jackson did not deny it. He only asked, quietly and without drama, that Samuel keep the conversation between the two of them for the time being. Later that same week, away from the building entirely, Samuel asked Jackson over a quiet lunch why he had let a man like Carter Voss claim credit for so many years without ever stepping forward to correct the record. Jackson answered that correcting the record had never been the point of the work in the first place, that he had built the program to keep people alive rather than to keep his own name attached to it, and that watching it survive, even imperfectly, under someone else's name had always mattered more to him than recognition ever could. Samuel did not entirely agree, but he respected the answer enough not to push further, and the two men finished their meal talking instead about easier things, old colleagues, better days, and the particular quiet that settles over a person once they finally stop running from who they used to be. Carter Voss heard about the exchange within hours, the way uncomfortable information always seems to travel faster through a building than comfortable information ever does. He did not know exactly who Jackson Bryant was, but he understood, almost instinctively, that anyone capable of unsettling a man like Samuel Reyes with a single glance across a lobby was not someone he could afford to have wandering freely through his territory. He began asking quiet questions of his own, pulling old vendor contracts late at night, trying to determine why a man from the dinner club kept appearing near the edges of his department's business. The more he learned, the more uneasy he became, until uneasiness curdled slowly into something closer to genuine fear sitting heavy in his chest. He tried, first, the gentle approach, suggesting to building management that outside contractors should be kept away from sensitive areas of headquarters entirely, a polite phrase that conveniently applied to almost no one except the dining club staff occasionally called in for executive functions. When that failed to remove Jackson from the picture, Carter shifted to something less subtle, quietly suggesting to a few colleagues over coffee that the strange new contractor asking questions around the building might not be entirely who he claimed to be, planting just enough doubt to make people hesitate before trusting him too quickly. It was the oldest tactic in his playbook, the same one he had relied on for years to protect a reputation built almost entirely on borrowed work, and it had always worked before now. Over coffee in the executive lounge, Carter mentioned casually to one of the junior risk officers that the new contractor wandering around the building asking questions had never actually passed a formal background screening. A claim that was entirely false but delivered with enough practiced confidence that the officer simply nodded and made a note to mention it further up the chain. It was the oldest tactic in his playbook, the same one he had relied on for years to protect a reputation built almost entirely on borrowed work. And it had always worked before now, back when no one had any reason to look closely enough to catch him in the lie. What Carter failed to account for was the growing list of small inconsistencies quietly stacking up against him on Margaret's desk. She compared his official biography against records from the early training program and found timelines that simply refused to align no matter how generously she read them. Samuel quietly confirmed, in a private conversation with Margaret over closed office doors, that the man currently cleaning up Carter's operational mistakes around the building was the same instructor who had once stood at the front of a room full of nervous new agents and taught them with total calm how to survive situations most people never had to imagine surviving. Diana knew none of this yet. She remained too consumed by the deepening operational crisis to notice the quiet, careful investigation unfolding 2 floors below her own office. The crisis arrived in full during the company's annual leadership summit, an event held at the very same private club where the disastrous dinner had taken place months earlier, this time with twice as many guests and far higher stakes resting on every detail. International partners, government liaisons, and major shareholders filled the same dining room that had once hosted a much smaller, quieter humiliation, and Whitfield Global's reputation for stability depended entirely on the night going smoothly from start to finish. Carter Voss had assured Diana, repeatedly and with his usual confidence, that his team had everything fully under control, that the gaps from the earlier audit had been addressed completely, and that nothing could possibly go wrong under his watch this time. The room that night felt different from the smaller dinner months earlier, charged with the particular energy of an event everyone understood mattered far beyond the food or the music. Camera crews from 2 business networks waited near the entrance for short interviews with arriving executives, and government liaisons from several visiting delegations mingled carefully among the shareholders. Each conversation weighed for diplomatic significance rather than simple pleasantry. Diana had rehearsed her opening remarks 3 times that afternoon alone, determined to project the same unshaken confidence she always projected, unaware that the night's real test would have nothing to do with anything she had prepared to say from the podium. Midway through the evening, a credible threat materialized with the kind of speed that left no time for committee meetings or careful deliberation of any kind. A disgruntled former contractor, recently terminated after his own security clearance had been quietly revoked without much explanation, attempted to force his way into the building through a service entrance that Carter's hastily patched protocols had failed to properly secure. Alarms began sounding through the lower levels just as the evening's keynote speeches were beginning upstairs, and within moments, panic started spreading through staff who had never been properly drilled for a real emergency rather than a comfortable paper exercise. Carter Voss froze completely. For all his confident talk over the years, he had never actually managed a live crisis of any real consequence, only the appearance of readiness for one in front of a board that rarely asked hard questions. The gap between performance and substance revealed itself in seconds, raw and undeniable. His team scrambled in 3 different directions at once, shouting conflicting instructions over crackling radios, while upstairs guests began murmuring uneasily, sensing that something had gone wrong without yet understanding what it might be. Diana, standing near the podium mid-introduction, felt the floor of her composure shift beneath her for the first time in years, watching her own security apparatus collapse exactly when it mattered most. Jackson Bryant had been working a quiet shift near the kitchen corridor that night, technically there only to help coordinate catering logistics for the evening. But the moment the alarms sounded, 12 years of training reasserted themselves in his body before his mind had even finished processing the danger. He moved toward the service entrance without hesitation, calm in a way that startled the panicking staff around him, issuing instructions in a low, steady voice that people obeyed instinctively, the way people always obey someone who clearly knows exactly what comes next. He redirected the intruder away from the main hall through a narrow service hallway, speaking in the same level tone he might have used to give directions to a lost guest, never once raising his voice or reaching for force when calm words could do the same work more safely. He kept his body angled between the man and the nearest stairwell leading up toward the main hall, closing off options one at a time the way he had once taught dozens of agents to do in rooms with far higher stakes than this one. The man, confused by the absence of panic in the voice speaking to him, slowed his pace almost without realizing it, and that single hesitation was all building security needed to finally close the distance and take him into custody without a single guest upstairs ever fully understanding how close the night had actually come to disaster. By the time Diana made her way down to the lower level, drawn by Margaret's urgent message buzzing repeatedly against her wrist, the threat had already been neutralized, and the room had gone strangely quiet except for the sound of radios crackling and staff catching their breath against the walls. She found Jackson standing near the service door, his jacket slightly torn at the shoulder, speaking calmly with two uniformed officers as though the entire incident had been nothing more than a minor scheduling inconvenience rather than a genuine threat to dozens of lives. Samuel Reyes stood nearby, watching with an expression that mixed relief with something close to quiet pride, and Margaret stood a few steps behind Diana, her face carrying the particular stillness of someone who finally understood everything she had been carefully piecing together for weeks. Diana asked, voice unsteady in a way she rarely allowed herself in front of staff, how he had known exactly what to do, how he had moved with such total certainty through a crisis her own trained security team had utterly failed to contain. Jackson hesitated for a long moment, the practiced reflex of a man who had spent years deliberately avoiding exactly this kind of attention, before finally answering that he had once done this kind of work for a living, a long time ago, before he chose a much quieter life for reasons that were entirely his own. Samuel stepped forward then, unable to stay silent any longer, and told Diana plainly that the man standing in front of her had personally built the very security doctrine her company had spent over a decade running on, the same doctrine Carter Voss had spent years quietly claiming as his own original invention. The silence that followed was different from the silence at that first dinner months earlier. It was heavier, more complicated, carrying the particular weight of a truth that rearranges everything a person believed about their own judgment up to that point. Diana looked at Jackson, really looked at him for the first time, seeing past the uniform entirely, and the memory of her own voice at that earlier dinner table rose up uninvited, the careless cruelty of assuming a man's worth from the cut of his suit and nothing more. She felt something close to shame settle into her chest, sharp and unfamiliar, because she understood in that exact moment exactly how much damage casual contempt could do when aimed carelessly at the wrong person. Carter Voss arrived on the lower level minutes later, breathless and visibly shaken, attempting immediately to reframe the night's events as a success story for his own department's quick response. His explanations grew thinner with every sentence he offered, especially once Margaret quietly produced the old personnel file with Jackson's name still legible beneath the redactions, and once Samuel confirmed, calmly and without any malice in his voice, exactly who had trained him personally all those years ago. Carter's bluster collapsed into something smaller and more desperate, a man watching the entire foundation of his professional identity crumble in front of the one person whose opinion had always mattered most to his career. Diana did not raise her voice at all. She simply told him, quietly and without theater, that their working relationship had ended that night, and that he should not expect a different outcome no matter how the story was eventually told to the board afterward. In the hours after the guests had finally been escorted home and the catering staff had quietly packed away the untouched dessert course, a strange calm settled over the lower level of Calloway House, the particular stillness that follows any night where disaster came close enough to touch and then simply did not happen. Staff who had panicked earlier now moved slowly, almost reverently, past the spot near the service door where Jackson had stood, some of them glancing at him with a new kind of attention they had never thought to offer the quiet contractor before that night. Oliver, the nervous young maitre, found himself telling the story to nearly everyone he passed for the rest of the week, each retelling growing slightly more admiring than the last. In the days that followed, Diana asked to meet with Jackson privately, away from the noise of headquarters and the growing curiosity of staff who had already begun talking quietly among themselves about the contractor who had apparently saved the summit. She chose a small, unremarkable coffee shop near the harbor rather than her own office, a deliberate choice meant to strip away the usual imbalance of power that always followed her into a boardroom. She told him, without rehearsed corporate language of any kind, that she was sorry, not only for the words she had said at that first dinner, but for the entire pattern of thinking that had allowed those words to come so easily in the first place. She admitted that she had spent years assuming competence, wore a particular uniform, a particular posture, a particular tone of voice, and that the assumption had nearly cost her company everything that mattered most. She admitted that she had spent years assuming competence, wore a particular uniform, a particular posture, a particular tone of voice, and that the assumption had nearly cost her company everything that mattered most. She told him that she had replayed that first dinner more times than she cared to admit, each time hearing her own voice a little more clearly, a little less forgivingly, until the memory had stopped feeling like an embarrassing slip and started feeling like a true measure of something she needed to fix in herself, rather than simply apologize for once and move past. Jackson listened without interrupting, the same patient stillness he had carried through every difficult room in his life. And when she finally finished speaking, he told her simply that he had not done what he did that night to prove anything to her or to anyone else watching. He had done it because the habit of protecting people who could not protect themselves had never really left him, no matter how many years he spent quietly trying to set it down for good. He told her, a little reluctantly, about Hannah, about the steady life he had built around her, about choosing ordinary work precisely because it asked nothing of the part of him that used to carry other people's safety as a daily exhausting burden. Diana asked, gently and without any pressure behind the question, whether he would ever consider returning to that kind of work in some smaller capacity, perhaps rebuilding the very program he had once created from nothing. He thought about it for a long moment before answering, the kind of pause that suggested he was weighing far more than just the offer sitting in front of him on the small table. He told her he would help, on his own terms and at his own pace, training a new generation properly rather than stepping back into any kind of spotlight himself, and that he expected no title, no public announcement, and certainly no apology tour staged for the comfort of the board. Diana agreed without hesitation, understanding, perhaps for the first time in years, that some forms of competence had never needed an audience to be entirely real. Word of what truly happened that night spread quietly through the company in the weeks that followed, not through any official statement or press release, but through the slow, organic respect that grows naturally when people witness quiet competence up close, with their own eyes. Carter Voss left the company without fanfare, the kind of quiet departure reserved for people whose stories simply stop being told once they no longer hold any power to enforce them. Jackson never sought him out, never asked for an apology, never mentioned the man's name again in front of anyone who might use it against him later. He returned, gradually and carefully, to training a small group of new security personnel, choosing his hours deliberately around Hannah's school schedule, and politely declining every attempt the company made to give him a formal title or hang a framed photograph of him somewhere in the lobby. Margaret once joked, half seriously, that he was the only senior trainer in the building's history who actively avoided being thanked in public, and Jackson simply smiled and said that the people he had trained doing their jobs well was thanks enough for anyone. Margaret once joked, half seriously, that he was the only senior trainer in the building's history who actively avoided being thanked in public, and Jackson simply smiled and said that the people he had trained doing their jobs well was thanks enough for anyone. Samuel eventually agreed to stay on as a permanent consultant rather than returning to his usual independent work, telling Margaret privately that he had not felt this useful in years, and that watching the program finally rest in honest hands again felt like something worth sticking around for. Diana visited the training facility occasionally afterward, usually without warning, slipping quietly into the back of the room to watch him work without interrupting. She never said much during those visits, content simply to observe the calm, exact way he corrected a young agent's stance or walked someone patiently through a scenario they had clearly never considered before that moment. There was no dramatic reconciliation between them, no grand public gesture meant to erase what had happened at that first dinner months earlier. There was only a growing, careful respect built slowly across small moments, a quiet recognition that some of the most important people in any room are rarely the ones speaking the loudest or sitting closest to the head of the table. On a quiet evening months later, as the training session ended and the last new agent filed out toward the elevators, Diana stayed behind a moment longer than necessary, watching Jackson gather his notes from the small folding table near the whiteboard. She thought, not for the first time, about how close she had come to never knowing any of this, about how easily contempt could have simply won the entire story if circumstances had unfolded only slightly differently that first night. There had been a version of that evening, she realized, where Jackson simply finished his shift, went home, and never crossed her path again, where the gaps in her company's protection would have stayed hidden until a far worse night finally exposed them without anyone capable of stopping it in time. She did not say any of this out loud. Some realizations she had come to understand mattered more privately held than spoken. Jackson glanced up, caught her watching, and offered the same small, steady nod he had offered her once before, long ago across a dinner table neither of them had ever quite forgotten. He gathered the last of his papers into a worn leather folder, turned off the overhead lights one switch at a time the way he always did, and walked with her toward the elevators in a silence that felt for the first time entirely comfortable between them. Outside, the evening air had turned cool, and somewhere across the city Hannah was almost certainly already asleep, unaware of how much had quietly changed in her father's world while she dreamed. For the first time since that night at Calloway House, Diana found herself simply grateful, without complication, that he had chosen, despite everything, to stay.